On January 23, 1947, snow began to cascade down upon southern England, marking the start of a relentless onslaught that would grip Britain in its icy grasp for an astounding 55 consecutive days. Every single day saw snowfall somewhere across the nation, exacerbating Britain's post-war woes. With the country already reeling from 6 exhausting years of war that had depleted resources and left urban landscapes in ruins, the harsh winter was a brutal blow. Food supplies were still rationed, and cities were in various stages of rebuilding when this winter nightmare unfolded. The severe freeze of 1947 plunged temperatures down to an extreme -21 degrees Celsius, buried entire villages under massive snowdrifts towering up to 7 meters, and effectively brought the nation to a halt. An estimated 4 million people found themselves suddenly out of work, as the persistent cold and snow rendered industries inoperative. Electrical power was so scarce that it was rationed to a mere 19 hours a day. When the bitter cold finally loosened its grip in March, the thaw brought with it catastrophic floods that inundated over 100,000 homes. This winter nearly shattered the spirit of the nation. Remarkably, this nightmare of a season began quietly. The early days of January 1947 were deceivingly mild, almost reminiscent of spring. On the night of January 15th, temperatures in Leaming, North Yorkshire, hovered unusually around 11 degrees. The following day, regions like Norfolk, Herefordshire, and Flintshire experienced a surprising warmth, reaching up to 14 degrees. There was idle chatter among the populace about the possibility of an easy winter. After the devastation of war, it seemed at least nature might show a little mercy. However, this reprieve was short-lived. By January 18th, a high-pressure system began its journey northwards from France. Within just 2 days, it positioned itself over northwest Norway, and then drifted southeastward to perch over southern Scandinavia, remaining stubbornly in place. This high-pressure wall effectively blocked the traditional weather patterns flowing in from the Atlantic Ocean, diverting them southward towards the Mediterranean. With Atlantic weather rerouted, Britain lay exposed to frigid, arid winds sweeping in from the east, winds that hailed directly from the depths of Siberia and crossed the vast North Sea. The frost made its first unwelcome appearance on January 20th, and by January 23rd, the snowstorms had commenced with a vengeance. Southern England, particularly the southwest, bore the brunt of the initial snowfall. Even the Isles of Scilly, where snow was a rarity, awoke under an unexpected blanket of 7 inches of snow. Down in Devon, the blizzard acted swiftly, isolating villages within mere hours as roads vanished beneath layers of snow. The storm was considered the most severe in the southwest since 1891, and troublingly, it was just the prelude for what was to come. Snow continued to fall, unrelenting and merciless. Each morning, the British people would awaken to a monochrome world blanketed in deep snow that refused to quit. Throughout the month of January, the highest temperature anyone managed to record in England and Wales was a mere 14 degrees, while chilling lows dipped to a bone-numbing -21. The abruptness of this transition from mild to Arctic conditions was baffling. Only a week prior, the country was enjoying relatively moderate weather, yet suddenly it found itself ensnared in unforgiving cold. Life at home became a test of endurance. In 1947, most homes lacked the luxury of central heating, forcing families to rely on a single coal fire in the living room, a boon only if they were fortunate enough to have coal. Families gravitated to this solitary warm room, huddling for warmth, as the rest of the house descended into an icy realm. Bedrooms were so cold that breath hung visibly in the air, and thick ice solidified on the insides of windows, obscuring outdoor views. Children, ingeniously, scraped patterns into the frost in an attempt to coax daylight into their dim rooms. Rising from bed became an ordeal, with clothes strategically placed under blankets overnight for warmth. Slippers were safeguarded beneath covers too, a necessity given the instant shock of the freezing floor upon naked feet. Mothers improvised, preparing hot water bottles and swaddling them in towels to fend off the biting cold. In an effort to stave off the cold, family members would crawl into bed about an hour before you, warming up the chilly sheets with their own body heat. By the time morning rolled around, however, these human heaters would be as cold as stone themselves. It became a necessity for some people to sleep in their coats, not out of choice, but as a crucial means of surviving the freezing night temperatures. Downstairs, the coal fire stood as the sole guardian against the bone-chilling climate. It was the lifeline that kept the household from turning into an icebox. Entire families would congregate in the living room, which became the nucleus of the home. Layer upon layer of jumpers were piled on, and blankets were draped over shoulders in a desperate attempt to trap every bit of the precious heat the coal fire emitted. The streets outside were cloaked in a perpetual veil of coal smoke, a bitter scent that was a constant reminder of the times. The coal that fueled these fires was diminishing alarmingly fast, marking the onset of a significant crisis for Britain. The predicament the nation faced was due to more than just the harsh winter weather. It was about the scarcity of coal, a commodity Britain no longer had in abundance. Before the war, at the beginning of winter, stockpiles of coal were ample enough to last 10 to 12 weeks. However, by January 1947, that supply was dwindled down to merely 4 weeks' worth. The war had siphoned resources dry, leaving mines critically understaffed and production plummeting. To make matters worse, heavy snowfall enveloped the country, obstructing roads and railways, making it impossible to get coal to the power stations that so desperately needed it. Emanuel Shinwell, serving as the Minister of Fuel and Power at the time, had received warnings as far back as October 1946 about an impending coal shortage that threatened the nation's energy supply. Despite this, he pinned his hopes on a mild winter to curb usage and avoid stirring up conflict with the coal miners. However, nature had its own plans, and the relentless snowfall dramatically altered the landscape. Stockpiles of coal at pits and depots froze solid, rendering them unusable. An immense fleet of 750,000 railway wagons loaded with coal became immobilized, stuck in place due to impassable tracks. Roads were choked with snow, making transport by land nearly impossible. Ships carrying much-needed coal struggled against the harsh elements, battling through violent storms, dense fog, and thick ice just to reach port and unload their critical cargo. Amid this chaos, power stations across the country began falling silent, one after the other. Their coal supplies dwindled until they were forced to shut down completely, leaving them without the means to generate electricity. On a fateful Friday, February 7th, Shinwell stood before Parliament to deliver a shockwave of an announcement that reverberated throughout the nation. Starting Monday morning, the government would execute a complete cut to electricity supplies for industrial operations in key regions like London, the Midlands, and the North West. Residential areas within these regions faced severe restrictions, with power outages scheduled for 5 hours daily, from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. and again from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Only the most essential services would continue to receive electricity. The effects were immediate and profound. Overnight, 4 million workers found themselves without jobs as factories shuttered and production ground to a halt. The backbone of Britain's export program collapsed under the strain, all amid a winter so bitterly cold that it was etched into the collective memory as one of the harshest on record. Public sentiment turned sharply against Shinwell, who became vilified as the man responsible for the nation's plight. Criticism hailed down from all corners. He was castigated for his failure to accumulate sufficient coal reserves and for not issuing timely warnings. His life was threatened, with death threats bombarding his residence and a bomb threat compelling law enforcement to station a constant guard at his home in Tooting. The press, relentless in its pursuit, savaged him without restraint. Even those newspapers typically aligned with the Labour Party distanced themselves, with only the Communist Daily Worker attempting a defence, though they placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the Tories. Yet, the seeds of this crisis had been sown much earlier and had been growing inexorably. As snow continued to blanket the country without respite, the situation offered no escape. Adaptation to life without power became the harsh, new reality for many. Homes received electricity for a mere 19 hours each day, depriving families of heating, light, and radio communication during the 5 hours of blackout. People resorted to using candles to combat the oppressive darkness and cold. The BBC slashed its broadcasts, television services were suspended indefinitely, magazines ceased production, and newspapers were reduced to a scant 4 pages, sometimes publishing no more than a single sheet. Even the majestic Buckingham Palace operated by the flickering glow of candlelight, and the venerable halls of Parliament were plunged into darkness. Astonishingly, even the Central Electricity Board itself found its operations crippled by the lack of power. In the midst of these dire straits, an international trade meeting with delegates from Russia and Iceland proceeded under bizarre conditions, deprived of both light and heat. Ironically, a part of their discussion centered on negotiating the purchase of British coal. Across the country, long queues formed at gasworks where people anxiously awaited rations of coke, a hardened, processed form of coal used for heating. Even aspirin supplies dwindled since it was derived from coal tar. As the cold gripped the nation tighter, thousands of chickens on poultry farms succumbed to freezing temperatures. Public transportation services were slashed in fuel-saving efforts, yet the relentless snowfall did not cease. It continued to blanket the landscape every single day for an astonishing stretch of 55 consecutive days. The snow accumulated rapidly, with temperatures barely climbing more than a degree or two above freezing, leading to towering drifts. Some areas reported snowfalls measuring 60 centimeters or more, while regions like Upper Teesdale and the Denbighshire Hills struggled beneath a staggering 150 centimeters of snow. Just imagine the sight, a staggering 5 feet of snow blanketing the landscape, a wonder in itself, but it was the colossal drifts that turned the situation into a crisis of epic proportions. Throughout Britain, snowdrifts, towering over 5 meters high, created impenetrable barriers, bringing both roads and railways to a standstill. In some regions, the drifts climbed to an astonishing 7 meters, effectively creating walls of snow that swallowed everything in their path. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath this icy layer, as houses were entombed, and telegraph poles were buried deep in the relentless white. Locomotives sat frozen in time, their engines rendered useless by the cold, appearing as if they were set pieces in a winter tableau rather than the dynamic machines they once were. Villages were transformed into isolated islands, cut off from the outside world. There were no deliveries, no letters from the post, no passage for supplies or rescue. In response to this dire situation, the armed forces stepped in with a dramatic aerial effort, deploying helicopters to drop essential food and medicine to remote farmsteads that had been isolated for weeks. On the ground, a massive operation marshaled the strength of 100,000 personnel, including British and Polish troops, alongside German prisoners of war who remained in the country after the conflict. This formidable force was charged with the manual task of clearing the snow from the railway tracks in a desperate bid to restore some semblance of connectivity. Despite being the largest peacetime operation Britain had ever organized, the enormity of the task meant it was still not enough to overcome nature's icy grip. In an extraordinary measure, the Royal Navy initiated Operation Blackcurrant, deploying submarines equipped with diesel generators to provide a lifeline of emergency power to coastal towns and dockyards plunged into darkness. These submarines were anchored along the coast, their engines humming with the effort of powering communities. The submarine crew members found themselves far from the battle-ready duties they'd signed up for, immersed in a different kind of war, one against the unyielding force of winter, and the assignment was not met with enthusiasm. Nonetheless, their mission was crucial to providing the necessary relief during this unprecedented cold snap. The engines on the boat required such substantial airflow that it created an icy draft throughout the vessel, day after day. This relentless cold didn't just stay on the boat, it seeped into every corner of daily life, affecting everything in its path. Lakes and rivers in the region, which people had relied on for transportation and resources, turned into solid sheets of ice. Even some harbors, where the salty seawater usually resisted freezing, succumbed to layers of ice. Coastlines were transformed as ice crept in from the sea and settled on beaches. Astonishingly, the River Thames, a symbol of British resilience, froze over for the first time in more than 200 years. Residents of London and tourists alike ventured onto the river as if it were a grand promenade, walking and skating in disbelief of the spectacle that unfolded before their eyes. However, this winter wonderland was no fairy tale for everyone. In rural areas, farmers stood by helplessly as livestock, unable to find shelter or warmth, succumbed to the cold in the open fields. It was a devastating loss, with over 2 million sheep and lambs perishing, and the toll included about 30,000 cattle. With the ground frozen solid, winter root vegetables, normally a staple during this time of year, were locked beneath the surface, unreachable by any conventional means of harvesting. Farmers, desperate to salvage something, resorted to using heavy machinery to extract potatoes from the earth, but the frost had already done its damage. Countless tons of crops were lost to the crushing cold. Just as the situation seemed dire enough, the supply of food began to falter. Vegetables that were usually accessible were trapped in the ground, and transport vehicles, incapacitated by icy roads, were unable to deliver what little food was left. Rationing, a remnant of wartime austerity, was tightened to such an extent that it even surpassed levels experienced during the conflict years. In an inventive but unappealing measure, the government tried to introduce snook, an inexpensive fish from South Africa. This unfamiliar substitution, however, was unpalatable to most and wound up being repurposed for cats. By the time February drew to a close, a genuine fear gripped the nation as many believed that food supplies might entirely deplete. Lines formed outside shops from the earliest hours of the morning, with bread becoming a coveted item. Sugar vanished from shelves, and butter was distributed sparingly, with shopkeepers only tending to their regulars to ensure they did not fully exhaust their stocks. People began to squirrel away any provisions they could gather in a state of near panic. Amidst these hardships, children found joy in the chaos. With schools closed, sometimes for weeks, It became a wonderland for youthful adventures. Sledges, hastily retrieved from sheds along with tea trays and borrowed baking sheets, transformed ordinary streets into zones of exhilaration and friendly territorial disputes. Endless snowball skirmishes and snowman building competitions brought out their creativity and energy. Kids returned home soaked and freezing but wore broad smiles as they warmed themselves up. For parents, this created other practical concerns, like finding ways to dry piles of wet clothing, as safety gear was not at the forefront of their minds. Woolen socks steamed dry by the fire, and gloves, stiff with ice, were placed by the hearth to thaw for the next day's icy outdoor escapades. Finally, on March 4th, the oppressive freeze began to relent as a mild southwesterly breeze swept across Britain. By March 6th, the frost had vanished, and temperatures soared to a balmy 17 degrees in London, the warmest it had been since October. However, the swift thaw introduced a new calamity. The still frozen ground refused to absorb the melting snow, causing the water to rush straight into swollen rivers. As if on cue, heavy rain commenced on March 10th across southern England, exacerbating the situation. Rivers overflowed in spectacular fashion, wreaking havoc on the landscape. Over 700,000 acres of land lay submerged and more than 100,000 properties, especially around the Thames and Trent rivers, were drowned in the chaos. The 1947 flood of the Thames proved to be the most catastrophic of the century, devastating towns like Maidenhead with over 2,000 homes flooded. Windsor, Eton, Reading, and other areas witnessed unrelenting deluges. The economic impact was staggering, with damage estimates ranging between £250 million and £375 million. In today's currency, the damage would equate to over a staggering £12 billion. Entire towns were transformed into vast lakes, while streets morphed into churning rivers, reshaping the landscape in ways people could scarcely believe. Those who had managed to survive the bone-chilling freeze now faced the devastating sight of their homes slowly filling with murky floodwaters. All the cherished belongings they had painstakingly safeguarded through the harshness of the cold were now being swept away. The relentless floods persisted for weeks, keeping entire regions submerged until well into April. The aftermath saw farmland devastated beyond recognition, and the crops that were the lifeline for many communities lay ruined. The wrath of the winter had stripped away far more than anyone had anticipated, inflicting widespread destruction. By February of 1947, the country's industrial output had plummeted by a concerning 10%. The vital harvests of cereals and potatoes suffered disastrous declines, falling an alarming 10 to 20%. The sheep farmers endured severe losses as well, with a quarter of their flocks perishing. Economically, the situation was dire, as the currency suffered a dramatic crash. Politically, the winter upheavals shattered public trust in the Labour government, which had once been a symbol of hope and change following the war. The people felt a profound sense of betrayal. They had cast their votes with dreams of a better future, only to be met with an absence of electricity, shortages of food, and a lack of answers from their leaders. The pressure culminated in the resignation of Emmanuel Shindwell in October. The Labour Party suffered significant political losses, with their seats dwindling as public confidence eroded. The fuel crisis of 1947 marked a turning point, forever sealing the public's loss of faith in their government. The colossal freeze of 1947 was an ordeal that could never be described as comfortable or easy. Yet, its impact was indelible, leaving a mark on history that would not soon be forgotten. Have your parents or grandparents ever recounted tales about that memorable winter? Perhaps you personally experienced that frosty season and carry your own vivid memories of those chilly days. What were the stories they shared with you? Was it about the swirling snowflakes that painted the world in white, or the biting cold that brought people together around a roaring fire? Maybe there were tales of community gatherings, winter festivals, or the simple joy of building snowmen and sledding down a powdery hill. We invite you to dive into these cherished memories and share your stories in the comments. Each comment is a chance to relive those special moments and keep the history alive. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss an opportunity to connect over shared memories and continue the tradition of storytelling.